Travelling south over the great downland ridgeway on the site of the old Dorchester Road, a magnificent panorama unfolds. Spread out below, with the sea on either side and only the intriguing profile of the island of Portland to break the horizon, lies what formerly was the borough of Weymouth and Melcombe Regis. The setting is glorious, and there is much more to Weymouth than its famous beach and reputation as one of the sunniest places in Britain. The old buildings, the harbour busy with boats, the great variety of the surrounding villages, all combine to make the area around Weymouth fascinating to explore. Either side of the town is the UNESCO Dorset and East Devon World Heritage Site, popularly called the Jurassic Coast. The heights of the ridgeway dominate the lower lying coastal plain occupied by Weymouth. They extend from Whitehorse Hill in the east to Abbotsbury Hill in the west. An ancient trackway, the Ridgeway, crosses the top of this chalky hill range, passing numerous prehistoric earthworks, whilst the old Roman road from Durnovaria, that's Dorchester, can still be traced descending the Weymouth side of the escarpment. Many springs emerge from the foot of the Ridgeway, which widen into streams and meander southward to the sea. Their water is copious and clear. 5 of them drain into the Fleet, the long brackish lagoon that divides Chesilbeach from the mainland. The small River Jordan runs from Sutton Poyntz down to Bowley's Cove. Preston Brook rises in the delightful Coombe Valley and discharges to Lodmore, while the 4-mile-long River Wey and its tributaries reach the sea via Radipole Lake and the harbour. The town of Weymouth originated along the northern side of the ridge fronting the harbour, between Boot Hill and Hope Square, probably well before the arrival of the Normans in 1066. Facing it, on the other side of the harbour, the separate town of Melcombe originated as a small group of houses near the water's edge, only accessible by tracks over the sandbanks from the north. Thus, and confusingly, what we now think of as Weymouth began life as Melcombe, whilst Melcombe itself only survives as a name. Old Weymouth's buildings and narrow streets were constrained by the lack of space between the escarpment and the water. In contrast, the medieval builders of Melcombe Regis had low flat land on which to establish the grid pattern of streets which is still seen today. Regis was added to its name in the 14th century, and the land remained owned by the Crown until given to the borough by Queen Elizabeth I. Generations of quay walls and wharves were built, and a rope ferry plied across the water. For centuries the two towns were in conflict over the use of the harbour, but in 1347 they managed to patch up their differences long enough to provide 20 ships for the siege of Calais at the start of the 100 Years' War. The following summer brought catastrophe. A mariner from Europe, afflicted with the plague, landed at Melcombe. This was no ordinary plague. The Black Death spread rapidly and spared no one, and by the time the final graves had been dug, it had claimed the lives of a third of the population. This was followed by numerous French raids on the port, which virtually wiped out trade and reduced the area to poverty. It took 2 centuries and the setting aside of petty rivalries for the towns to regain their prosperity. In 1571 they were formed into a single borough. Shortly afterwards, as if to symbolise their union, a wooden bridge was built over the harbour, linking the two communities. The present town bridge of Portland stone has a lifting deck whose 2 arms are raised several times a day to allow larger vessels to move to and from the marina. It was opened by the Duke of York, later King George VI, in 1930, replacing a narrow stone and iron swing structure which had served the town since 1824. Facing the bridge is the soaring front of Holy Trinity Church, complete with underground catacombs, positioned so as to give as much impact as possible. Architecturally, the harbour reflects the various phases when it was at its busiest and most prosperous. There have been some sad losses. In the 1960s, the entire old Weymouth High Street, including some Tudor housing, was cleared to make way for the featureless council offices block. In contrast, along Trinity Road and the streets around the eastern end are carefully restored terraces of intermixed Victorian, Georgian and earlier buildings, their backs tightly pressed against the cliff face. In Trinity Street is a rare gem, the restored Tudor house, which visitors can see inside, just as it was when it was the home of a 16th century merchant. Weymouth Marina, the inner harbour below Weston Bridge, has been dramatically transformed since it was the town's backwater. From 1834, when a huge gasworks was built, the mud banks on both sides have been reclaimed by the building of quay walls and harbourside roads. In the last years of the 20th century, the waterfront has changed beyond recognition. Where was once dominated by timber ponds, warehouses, shipyards, and a profusion of workshops and businesses associated with a bustling port, now smart apartments and a shopping centre look out over one of the most sheltered marinas on the south coast. Foreign shipping regularly moored alongside Weymouth Waterfront from the early 18th century. It was also the home port of a handful of ships trading with Newfoundland, and several large warehouses on the harbour side date from this period. Many of these historic buildings have now very different uses. Weymouth has the shortest sea route to the Channel Islands, and there have been regular maritime services between the two since the Middle Ages. The introduction of the post office packet service to the Channel Islands in 1794 started a new era in the port's prosperity. The link was never without problems. Many sailing vessels were lost in the stormy channel, and early packets were even armed to counter attacks from the French during the Napoleonic Wars. In due course, the packets were replaced by 3 steamer paddle boats. Despite Weymouth's small tidal range, major work was needed to build up and retain strong working quays to accommodate the ever-increasing size of vessels using the port. The arrival of the railway in 1857 was soon followed by branch lines to both Portland and along the harbour's edge to the commercial pier. The Weymouth Quay tramway gave passengers and goods direct access to ferries and cargo vessels. Trade with the Channel Islands expanded, and the enlargement of the piers and shore facilities continued through the 20th century. The Great Western Railway took on the Channel Islands run in 1889, which went from strength to strength. Fruit, vegetables and flowers were the major imports, and when in season 100 tons of daffodils and 50,000 packages of tomatoes a day were being landed in open boxes on the quayside. The presence of a railway capable of carrying mainline trains along rails in a busy street to the quay never ceased to amaze visitors. There is no longer any service on this line. The Second World War brought drama and movement on an unprecedented scale as the ports of Weymouth and Portland became embarkation points for the hundreds of thousands of Allied troops and their vehicles bound for the great D-Day assault on Normandy. A plaque on Weymouth's seafront war memorial commemorates the local people lost in the historic conflict. After the war, Weymouth became a lifeline for commercial trade from the liberated Channel Islands, importing more than 1 million tonnes in 1946. Containerisation at larger rival ports eventually put an end to the frantic quayside bustle. The huge steel cranes have gone, and there could be no greater contrast than that between the sedate steamers of old and the sleek hydrofoil ferries introduced in 1987. But the days of sail are certainly not over. Alongside the commercial fishing boats, Weymouth is a magnet for hundreds of leisure craft from all over Europe, and when the magnificent tall ships of the world put into port, the scene in the bay and harbour is spectacular. Hope Square by Brewers Quay was originally an inlet, an ope, of the harbour, which was infilled towards the end of the 18th century. By 1817 several rows of houses had been built over it, some of which were demolished in the 1880s when the harbour was widened to enable large steamers to swing round. Dominating this part of the town is a group of cavernous Victorian breweries and malt houses whose brick chimney stack towers over the surrounding roofs. For centuries the area was characterised by an industrial atmosphere of the most pleasant kind. The clang of barrels and the rhythmic thump of coopers' hammers, the clatter of hooves, the shouts of men loading drays, and the all-pervading strong, sweet aroma of malt in the air. Transformation came in the last decade of the 20th century, after brewing had stopped, and this former working area became filled with cafes, pubs, charming little shops and art galleries. Visitors now throng to the colourful block-paved square and waterside streets for refreshment and entertainment. The huge malt houses have been cleverly converted to apartments, and in the 1990s the brewery itself was imaginatively redeveloped into an award-winning time walk, where, by the use of latest technology, visitors were taken on a vivid journey through 600 years of Weymouth and Portland's history. Unfortunately, the time walk has gone, as the old brewery awaits some reincarnation. This is also home to Weymouth Museum, a fascinating treasure house of objects and archived documents to enrich knowledge of the area's past. Nothe Parade is one of the quaintest parts of the harbour. Striking out from the Nothe Peninsula is the stone pier, a rebuilding of an ancient structure giving vital shelter to the harbour entrance against prevailing seas. Weymouth Lifeboat Station and the range of historic houses fronting the parade's narrow roadway add to its attractions. It used to be a working quay. Weymouth's latest lifeboat, the Ernest and Mabel, took up station in September 2002. She is the latest and most powerful in a proud line of vessels dating back to 1869, when the port's first lifeboat was commissioned. Until the first motor lifeboat arrived in 1924, all the craft were powered by oars and sail. Weymouth and its neighbour Portland, due to their location, have always been vulnerable to attack from across the Channel. The area also experienced fighting during the Civil War in the 17th century and witnessed action between the English fleet and the Spanish Armada just off this coast. The steep-sided rock promontory of the Nothe gives excellent natural protection to the harbour mouth. It was a superb vantage point for the defence of the town and its approaches, so gun batteries were mounted here from the earliest days of ordnance. 1849 saw the start of one of Victorian Britain's greatest engineering projects. The anchorage of Portland Roads, south of Weymouth, was developed into a vast harbour of refuge for the nation's burgeoning navy and merchant ships. Portland Harbour was transformed by the construction of enormous stone breakwaters. The scheme took half a century to complete and had a great and lasting impact on the development of Portland and Weymouth. To defend this new harbour and its approaches from a prospective enemy, and the French remained a fearful threat, a range of coastal defences was planned. 3 great fortresses were built, on the Nothe, on Portland's Verne Hill, and on the new breakwater itself. Designed by the Royal Engineers, they were all incredible feats of ingenuity and engineering skill. For 12 years from 1860, the rocky headland of the Nothe was a scene of frenetic activity, while the Nothe fort was developed. Protected by massive sea and retaining walls, its formidable defences contained more than 70 rooms on 3 levels. Heavy guns were mounted above and within its ramparts to sweep the coast, cross-firing with those on the Portland forts. As with so many of its contemporaries, the detailing of its massive stone masonry has a striking beauty. Nothe Fort saw much activity during the Second World War when Weymouth and Portland were under frequent air attack. It remained in military hands until 1961, when it was sold to the Weymouth Council. Plans were drawn up to convert it into a luxury hotel, and construction work actually started. That work was abruptly abandoned, and dereliction set in until the council started restoration work in 1978. A year later, the enterprise was taken over by Weymouth Civic Society, whose 25 years of enthusiastic voluntary effort has safeguarded a remarkable historic feature. The whole headland, once under military occupation, is now dedicated to peaceful enjoyment and recreation. The beautifully landscaped Nothe Gardens extend right over the peninsula from Harbour to the southern shore, where in 2003 a new promenade to Newton's Cove has added yet another major amenity to the town. From every vantage, the eye is drawn along the gentle sweep of Weymouth Bay. The sands at the southern end merge into a fine shingle towards Greenhill, and northward along the enlarged beach to Overcombe. This southeast-facing beach is ideally situated to catch the morning sun, warming the shallow waters ready for paddlers and bathers. From a distance, the long, grand Georgian terraces have a delightful symmetry. They form a perfect backdrop, and their continuity makes an effective break to the prevailing westerly breezes. Most bathing beaches look seaward to a featureless horizon, but not here. Instead, there is a distant roller coaster of the green-topped white cliffs of the South Dorset coast, undoubtedly one of the most pleasant coastal scenes in the country. The vista has long inspired artists. The celebrated J.M.W. Turner produced a delightful watercolour of the beach on his visit in 1811, at a time when several of the great Georgian terraces were still under construction. 5 years later, the landscape artist John Constable, on honeymoon at nearby Osmington with his wife Maria, produced a series of fine watercolours of Weymouth Bay and the coves. All changed after the carriage carrying King George III from London first descended the rough road down the hillside towards Weymouth. His brother, the Duke of Gloucester, had already discovered the delights of this beautiful and unspoilt watering place when in 1780 he chose a prime position facing the beach to build Gloucester Lodge. Encouraged to try sea bathing for his own health, the king came to stay there 9 years later. He enjoyed the experience so much that he spent 14 extended holidays in the town between 1789 and 1805. Along with his queen, Charlotte, and his many children, there came a whole army of servants, courtiers, gentry, and affluent visitors, for whom accommodation had to be provided. Entrepreneurs rose to the occasion, and local architects, led by the remarkable James Hamilton, produced the grand vision for a new seafront development for the town. By the turn of the 19th century, the land behind Weymouth's beach was a scene of building frenzy, as enormous quantities of Portland stone, bricks, timber and slates arrived by barge and haulage cart. Over the next few decades, hundreds of skilled craftsmen and labourers, busy with barrows, wooden scaffolding and hoists, built one of England's finest classic esplanades. The designs had to satisfy more than aesthetics. To erect great continuous terraces on the loose, gravelly land was a formidable structural challenge. Most of the large buildings have basements excavated almost to sea level and rise to 3 or 4 stories above ground. The 4 most prominent terraces have perfectly rounded ends, an architectural inspiration which softens the vista. It is testimony to some far-sighted Georgian, Regency and Victorian minds that we can still appreciate their majestic work after nearly 2 centuries. The esplanade we now see was largely completed by 1855. Originally lined with private houses for the fashionable, most were converted into hotels and guest houses for a new generation of tourists who arrived en masse after the arrival of the railway. The terminus disgorged the visitors just a short walk from the beach. The long summers of the royal visits were fully described in newspapers of the time. People came from all over the country, but the raison d'etre was always sea bathing. Weymouth was launched on its greatest and most prosperous period. For a while it was the most fashionable town in the country. In honour of their royal patron, its citizens commissioned a large statue of George III, resplendent in his robes, to stand on an enormous plinth of Portland stone. The stoneware figure, modelled from life, was cast in London and brought to the town in the ship Lovell in 1804. It was then stored for 5 years before a location for it was agreed, facing along his beloved seafront. Princess Mary laid the foundation stone in October 1809, when corn, oil and wine were sprinkled on the mortar, and the celebrations and fireworks went on into the night. A year later the completed king's statue, guarded by a magnificent golden lion and white unicorn, was unveiled. The name of J. Hamilton, architect, whose architecture embodies Georgian Weymouth, is rightly included in the bold inscription on the plinth. As well as designing 3 of Weymouth's seafront terraces and producing the sketch for the chalk figure of the king on horseback cut in the side of Osmington Hill, Hamilton went on to design St. Mary's Church, completed in 1817. It is in the same part of St. Mary Street where once stood an ancient friary. The smooth exterior walls are of fine jointed Portland stone ashlar. Above the triangular pediment on the west front a single bell hangs under a pillared dome. In the graceful and light interior is a superb piece of the Last Supper painted by the famous Sir James Thornhill. The artist was born not far away in what is now the White Hart Public House in New Bond Street. His masterpiece remains the great painting inside the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, London. Thornhill was a friend of the famous painter and engraver William Hogarth, who eventually married his daughter. In total contrast to St. Mary's is the Church of St. John, beyond the north end of the esplanade. Since 1859 the tall, slender spire of this fine Gothic revival edifice has reached high over the townscape, a point of reference over a wide area. The first proper promenade was built in 1800, but this had to be completely reconstructed after the catastrophic Great Storm of 1824, which also destroyed much of the villages of Fleet and Chisel, Portland. The esplanade was progressively developed, and by 1887 it extended north of Greenhill. For well over 100 years, swimmers could change in the many bathing machines, which were wheeled into the water all along the beach. Until the Great War, undressing in public was frowned upon, and even children on the sands were clothed from head to foot. All such modesty was thrown to the wind after the Roaring Twenties. The Victorians continued to enhance the esplanade with traditional seaside features. Beautifully designed cast-iron shelters, the Alexandra and Greenhill public gardens, and the Jubilee clock, which soon became the popular symbol of Weymouth. It is a central feature on the esplanade, positioned to catch the eye of tourists arriving from the railway station. Fundraising for the clock tower began in 1887, Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee year, but most was spent on entertainment and celebrations, leaving only £150 for the clock. A benefactor, Sir Henry Edwards, came to the rescue, and the exuberant unveiling took place the following year. The 15-metre high cast-iron tower was made by a Glasgow foundry. It is painted in rich colours, and lavish gilding adorns the ornate mouldings. No seaside town is complete without its theatres and piers. Weymouth's Town Theatre, the Pavilion, was built in 1960 on a pier between the harbour and the sea. The first theatre on this reclaimed site was a fantastically elegant Edwardian structure made entirely of wood. Perhaps inevitably, this burnt down in 1954 in one of the biggest fires the town had ever seen. In 1939, a revolutionary new building projecting over the water at Greenhill was opened. Throwing tradition to the wind, this short, stubby Art Deco pier bandstand was an open-air theatre, sleek, stylish, lit with 760 metres of neon tubing. Its inadequate concrete legs proved its downfall, and the 3,000-ton pier was eventually demolished in 1986. The original entrance block was left high and dry on the beach and remains a rather unsightly interruption to the gentle sweep of the bay, but it does contain a superb restaurant. Beach entertainment has changed with the times, but simply playing on a warm, soft carpet of sand has remained the chief delight through generations of children and adults. The appeal of a Punch and Judy show is universal, and into the 21st century the current professor continues the tradition of this timeless show on Weymouth sands. The town now has a vibrant nightlife with numerous pubs, clubs and restaurants, and a multi-screen cinema. The water in summer is animated with swimmers, windsurfers and water skiers, and since Victorian times, Weymouth Bay and Portland Harbour have been recognised as providing some of the best sailing in the country. Visitors can now ascend a high observation tower on the pier to take in a 360-degree panorama of the seafront and harbour. The River Wey begins its journey as a series of tiny streams emerging from beneath the hills, the most famous of them at the Wishing Well at Upwey. So narrow is the picturesque Upwey Valley between steep tree-covered hills that in winter the sun scarcely reaches the lush floor of the ravine. For more than 500 years the Church of St. Lawrence has been the valley's focal point. With its tall, square bell tower, it is the epitome of the simple but sturdy English country church. George III was among countless visitors to make excursions to Upwey and its Wishing Well, a centuries-old tradition. The first of several large water mills on the still small River Wey is just below the Wishing Well. The present building is 200 years old, but a succession of mills on the site can be traced back to the Domesday Book. As well as inspiring Thomas Hardy's story, The Trumpet Major, the grinding of the mill's 4 pairs of millstones, the ponderous creaking of the gears of the giant mill wheel, with the endless sound of water tipping from its buckets, adds to the timeless atmosphere of the place. A little downstream, past the street of cottages at Elwell, The Way passes some of the most beautiful small mansions in Dorset. These range from Westbrook House, dating from 1620, to the 19th century Southbrook, Eastbrook and Upwey houses, each in their own landscaped parkland. These, together with the lofty gabled Upwey Manor of 1639, at the junction of Stottingway Street, and numerous smaller buildings, are among the 100 or so listed buildings in this part of Weymouth. The Way flows on through a floodplain to Broadway, where it becomes a ford, a public highway. Here, part of the stream is diverted under another mill and meanders on to Nottington. This village is in two parts, separated by the river. Among the collection of mainly early 19th century buildings on the edge of the water meadows is Nottington's Mill, the third one on the Way. On the other side of the river is one of Weymouth's most unusual buildings, the tall octagonal Nottington Spa House. For centuries, a spring on this spot was believed to have had medicinal, almost magical healing powers, bringing travellers to sip or wash in its sulphurous waters. Radipole is one of the few parts of Weymouth mentioned in the Domesday Book. The neighbouring hills gave fine views of the lower Wey Valley, now crossed by a bridge carrying the Weymouth Relief Road. But it is difficult to realise that until the 1920s, this little floodplain was open to tidal water. In its heyday, Radipole was probably the site of a Roman port, where supplies were landed to be taken via the Roman road to Maidencastle and Dorchester. To the northeast of the water meadow lie a trio of historic buildings, all built of Portland stone: the old Radipole Manor, the ancient St Anne's Church, and the former village schoolhouse. The beautiful Elizabethan manor house has mullioned windows and a series of stone gables crowned with carved finials. It is one of the finest and best preserved 16th century houses in the area, and its story is embellished with romantic legend. Passed down through the centuries are tales of unholy liaisons between monks and nuns in its long-lost vaults and passages. Nestling against the old manor is the ancient church of St Anne, originally the mother church of Melcombe Regis. It enjoys a cosy setting on the west-facing slope of the Wey Valley, and for some 700 years was a centre of communal activity and worship. Much of the nave dates from about 1250, making it one of the oldest buildings in Weymouth. Subsequent centuries brought extensions to this little church, but mid-Victorian enthusiasm sadly stripped away a few of the original elements. One unusual feature is the Italianate-style triple bell turret. The little tumbling churchyard has many interesting monuments, including some to shipwreck victims. A few paces across the lane from the church is the old village school, hardly altered since it was built in 1840. Here, lessons behind regimented rows of desks have now given way to the glee of preschool children. A winding road leads through Radipole village, at its heart a small three-arched bridge over the still narrow River Wey. A sprinkling of stone cottages, some thatched, and several secluded larger houses complete the picture. Radipole, too, has its water mill, since the late 18th century, hidden from the road near the quiet West End cottages. Below Radipole, the River Wey used to fan out into a wide water meadow, but it is now channelled into sharply cut ditches as part of a water management scheme. Augmented by 8 upstream tributaries, the river passes under the Weymouth Way road bridge and then broadens out into Radipole Lake. Picturesque Sutton Poyntz lies at the junction of two streams and is surrounded by hills. More than 1,000 years old, it was once a manor with its own church, of which there is now no trace. What do remain are lovely old thatched cottages and willows shading a tranquil duck pond. One of the many pleasant walks from Sutton Poyntz leads to White Horse Hill, where an enormous figure on the chalk hillside depicts George III mounted on his favourite grey charger, which he often preferred to riding in a carriage. The White Horse was cut in 1808, just 3 years after the last of the popular monarch's many visits to the town. Periodical weeding and recutting over time has slightly changed the royal profile. Climbing Plaisters Lane northwesterly from Sutton Poyntz and looking towards Portland, the scene is dominated by Charlbury Hill, crowned by massive earthworks of an Iron Age fort. The climb is steep, but the reward is a breathtaking panoramic view from Weymouth Bay over Portland to Lyme Bay and beyond. The original village of Preston lay in the shallow valley of the Jordan, overlooked by the pretty St Andrew's Church. The tiny hamlet of Bincombe is easily overlooked. Served by a single road and sheltered by the eastern ridge scarp, it is the quietest of all the settlements around Weymouth, lying just outside the borough. Almost untouched for generations, farming is much in evidence on the steep hillsides behind a small cluster of houses and farm buildings. At the eastern end, along an unmade lane, is the secluded church, set in a group of trees. This is a truly ancient building, whose most modern part is the square tower which was added over 500 years ago. Until the 20th century, the old village of Wyke Regis, set in a hollow in the landscape, was entirely surrounded by rolling fields. The forming of Portland Harbour accelerated change throughout the area and had an immense impact on Wyke. In 1891, a huge factory was built on the edge of the harbour at Ferry Bridge. The Whitehead Torpedo Company pioneered and led the world in the development of torpedoes and went on to build houses for its workers, a school and a community centre. After the Second World War, new housing estates were built over the downland between Wyke, Portland Harbour and the Rodwell side of Weymouth. Like most ancient settlements, Wyke Regis was founded alongside a small watercourse. It was probably well established in Saxon times, growing into a manor with its own court leet. In the Middle Ages, when the village and its farmlands were a royal domain, hence the Regis title, the Wyke boundaries encompassed a good part of what is now Weymouth. Wyke Regis' original church was replaced by the present All Saints' Church in 1455. This is a fine building in the Perpendicular style, befitting its original role as the mother church of Weymouth. It is a living church, but on entering you could be stepping back into the 15th century. It has changed so little. The heavy south door is made of thick planks roughly nailed together and glows with a patina of centuries. Gazing down on the nave are a number of carved figures and faces, including those of Henry VI and his queen Margaret of Anjou, who were on the English throne when the church was built. For company they have small effigies of early musicians and craftsmen, pieces recovered from the earlier church on the site. Wyke Regis Church was for centuries an important landmark, especially for mariners navigating past the shambles east of Portland Bill. By aligning the tall square tower with the northeast point of Portland, they could avoid that dangerously shallow shoal. The church stands on rising ground above the old village square, tastefully enlarged by new development in the 1990s. Here the original stream briefly merges to run through an old horse trough before disappearing into culverts down to the sea. Old Wyke Village is now a rich mixture of building styles of many periods. The 400-year-old manor farm just west of the church was, until the 1980s, a rare working survival of the traditional small English farm. The historic features of its enclosed yard, stone sheds and farmhouses have been retained in its conversion to domestic use. One amazing piece of eccentricity is Wyke Castle. Built some 150 years ago, in an age when classically proportioned architecture was the norm, its designer was clearly a free spirit. Never a castle, but a dwelling built for a French doctor, it has a wide circular tower, crenellated walls at odd angles, and other unusual features. but it has survived almost unscathed and still enjoys one of the finest views in South Dorset. The influx of the Navy from mid-Victorian times brought unprecedented prosperity to Portland and Weymouth during its 150-year presence. Tourism and development boomed, but the building of the breakwaters also had dramatic and unexpected events. Currents which had naturally moved waterborne material and accumulated sand along the Weymouth shore of the new Portland Harbour were no more. Weymouth's south-facing coast, between Bincleves and Ferry Bridge, had previously been a wide expanse of firm yellow sand, rivalling Weymouth's main beach. Here promenaders would stroll on warm summer evenings, and families could relax in the shelter of the grassy banks. The old road to Portland also went along this shore, to the ferry at Smallmouth Sands, where the first bridge to Portland was built in 1839. This waterside road was fed by the main turnpike road from Weymouth, before alternative routes were developed in the early 19th century. Even while the harbour was being formed, most of these sands and the last vestiges of the shore road were already being washed away. Dominating this southern shore is Sandsfoot Castle, approached through ornamental gardens from Old Castle Road. Before the breakwaters were built, this part of the coast was exposed to the open sea. Consequently, southeasterly storms eroded the soft stone outcrop on which Sandsfoot Castle had stood since 1539. This historic stronghold was built as part of the chain of coastal defences for Henry VIII. Together with its partner Portland Castle on the opposite shore, it was designed to cover this vast and important anchorage, a potential landing place for any of Henry's enemies from the Catholic countries. It was a fine building with a large octagonal gun platform on its southern side. The walls were so thick that the staircases and privies were contained within them. However, it was abandoned for military use in 1645, and by Georgian times much had disappeared down the receding cliff. There have been many falls since, but enough remains to show the scale and the workmanship. Some of the workstone was even recycled from a medieval abbey, although much of the fine ashlar facing has been lost. Odd pieces of tooled masonry can still be found scattered among the rocks below. Sandsfoot Castle can now be explored at very close quarters, for in 2012 an ambitious scheme to consolidate the remains and provide an access walkway to the interior was inaugurated. Before the 1920s, the incoming tide washed up from the harbour mouth into the wide expanse of shallow water of Radipole Lake, there meeting the River Wey. In its natural state, Radipole Lake was separated from Weymouth Bay by a huge peninsula of sand and shingle. As the old town of Melcombe Regis developed on that spit, a succession of walls and reclamation pushed inward the eastern shores of the lake and its lower reaches called the backwater. The regular drying out of the shallow, muddy silt banks in warm weather created a rather unsavoury atmosphere. Victorian attempts to overcome this problem included the construction of a gated weir to maintain the water level in the lake. In 1921, Western Bridge, actually a dam with sluiced culverts, was built, stopping the sea from entering and turning the former open lagoon into a freshwater lake. For a few years a steam dredger was employed to remove the silt brought down by the River Wey, but by the 1950s large islands of reed beds had formed, the reed being harvested by thatchers. Fortunately, plans to reclaim the lake for football pitches, car parks and buildings came to nothing, and it is now a major nature reserve. A network of footpaths through its water meadows and dense scrub enable everyone to enjoy this lovely habitat and to study some of the 250 species of birds, some of them rare, which have been recorded there. In spring and summer the air is filled with birdsong and calls. Swans, butterflies and dragonflies abound, and even otters may be seen. It is surprising that such a tranquil haven of nature can exist so near the heart of a busy town. Weymouth is fortunate in having two nature reserves. Lodmore is a true floodplain into which storm waters from the surrounding hills collect. It is almost miraculous that it has survived in its present environment. Horse racing took place here in the 19th century, and from 1849 various attempts were made to drain and reclaim it. The 1920s saw a small aerodrome established, and then half a century's worth of the town's rubbish was dumped on part of it. From the 1930s to the 1970s, there were determined efforts to develop it in one way or another. Plans ranged from a vast garden village, formal sports pitches, a marina with a cut through to the sea, to a vast Butlins holiday camp, which was stopped only after a public inquiry. Lodmore, like Radipole Lake, remains a priceless habitat for wildlife, managed by the RSPB. The reserve has beautiful walks and hides to observe the bearded tits, Chetty's warblers, lapwing, and the many waders and other birds which shelter in the surrounding reeds. Lodmore Country Park has also an internationally renowned sea life park. This is a sanctuary for the preservation and study of marine species, including sharks, seals and seahorses, complemented by assorted entertainments and restaurants. Lodmore is separated from the sea by Preston Beach, a natural ridge of fine shingle through which water could flow, at times in either direction. A wall built at the turn of the 19th-20th century at the back of the beach did not prevent the main road behind it from being frequently closed by floods. This was finally resolved when a £6 million sea defence scheme was completed in 1996, which included a fine new esplanade which almost doubled the length of Weymouth's seafront promenade. This coast protection work was put to the test in the great storms of 2014, when vast quantities of finer beach material were washed away. Although the road was not actually flooded, it was closed as a precaution several times. The Environment Agency responded by bringing in nearly 4,000 tonnes of Portland stone rock to protect the foundations, which was then covered with sand and shingle, making the beach once again looking like new. Let's take another look at the busy and colourful harbour in the 21st century, and then we'll see some recent changes along the esplanade. Weymouth Harbour was the scene of intense activity during the 2012 Olympics sailing events, which took place in Portland Harbour and in Weymouth Bay. back to the seafront, where the changes have certainly been controversial. By 2010, the traditional multicoloured festoon lighting, which for more than 60 years had defined the nighttime border of Weymouth Bay, had become tired and neglected. Very expensive to maintain, but instead of opting to replace this with 21st century coloured LED lights, as many other resorts have done, the council decided to install what's proved to be a highly provocative laser display. They called it Veils of Light, shafts of intense green light projected onto the sea from tall columns at intervals along the esplanade. The displays are seen to best advantage from the pavilion pier, where the constantly changing patterns make an interesting spectacle. Edwardian shelters, the King's statue, and the centrepiece, the Jubilee clock, add their elegance to what is still one of England's finest seaside esplanades.